Education should not be a privilege that someone have to fight for. Education should be a basic human right that everyone have access towards. The moment that this kind of education is perceived as a privilege is the moment that the state has failed in its duty to cater to its citizens. 3 things we're going to prove to you in this debate. First, on why education in and of itself is a basic right. Second, on why development in education system is much more important than economic growth. And third, on how we're going to make education much more accessible on our side of the house. But before that, setup. First, what are these developing states? We'd like to tell you that this developing education system in developing states are going to be inadequate because first, it's going to be really centralized, which means that only a certain part of the area of the state in and of itself have actual good education. And second, education system in and of itself is unstandardized. Even if there's a lot of state-owned education, state-owned schools, for example, in different parts of the city, in the different parts of the areas, in different parts of the states, it's still not going to be as good as those that is actually already inside the heart of the city, for example, right? Second, we'll also like to characterize to you that people in these developing states does not truly understand the importance of good education. Most of the time, these people are focused on the short-term gains, for example, them prioritizing money over this actual good education, them not willing to send their children to this kind of good schools, for example, or them not wanting their children to continue their studies to a higher level, for example, because they're going to ask their children to have much to actually make more money, for example, right? Those are the kind of people that we're actually dealing with in status quo. Second, then, on how we're going to focus more on educational development. First, we're going to focus more on the standardization of education. So we would like to advocate for this kind of education to be more standardized and to be better for each and everyone, no matter on where you are in the state in and of itself. Second, we would like to put more funds into the educational system in and of itself, which means that there's going to be much more state-owned schools that's going to be spread all across the state, for example, right? And there's also going to be much more funds that's actually given to the unis, for example, so that they're able to accept much more people to a higher level of education. Third, then, we would also like to make laws that advocate for the actors between the educational system, so that people are much more incentivized to actually care more about the educational system. For example, us giving higher wages towards teachers, so that there's much more teachers that are actually willing to take a job as a teacher, because it is just really undervalued in our current status quo. Third, then, on how economic growth is going to be part of a nation goal, but it wouldn't be on the main focus. There's lawmaking or those kind of lobbying will still happen on both sides of the house, but on our side of the house, we're going to prioritize much more on our educational development. Onto my arguments then. First, on how education is a basic right of the people and it is state responsibility to provide the accessible education. Education is directly tied to your livelihood. We currently live in a capitalistic world with really strong value in meritocracy, which means that your ability to get a stable job is inherently dependent on your educational merit. This looks like you have to get a certain degree of education so that you're able to have a stable and well-paying job. This looks like you having to go through a lot. Looks like you having to go through and get through a lot of good grades, for example, for you to able to go to the next step of education. This in and of itself is already shown you the dire importance of good education, because without good education, you're not going to be able to have a stable or well-paying job. Second, then, education in and of itself is something that is cumulative, meaning that when you learn something new, you're going to add on one another and it's going to complete one another. When you don't have actual good basic of education, it's going to be really detrimental to you to be in a competitive job market where you don't really have that basic of a good education. When you are going to have this kind of good educational basic, it's going to be helpful towards you to help to even have the next step of this education system, for example, right? For example, when you have good scores in your when you have good scores in your high schools, then you're going to be able to get to a better university, for example. Those are the kind of things that's going to be happening on our side of the house. Why then this kind of good job, this kind of good grades, or this kind of good actual education is really important in actual job market. First, our current job market are really dependent on the meritocracy system. When you're actually accepting new people to join your company, for example, you're going to ask about their past education system. They're going to ask about this kind of past achievement that you have went through to actually be able to have this sort of jobs, right? So it's really important for us to shift the focus towards like education system, especially towards those that don't really understand the importance of the education system in and of itself. On our side of the house, we're also going to actively tell you, we're also going to actively advocate for people to know the importance of education system in and of itself. Second, then, on how we're going to make it much more accessible on our side of the house. When we tell you that we're going to make it less centralized, we mean that we're going to impose this kind of like funds into making like much more schools in like a larger amount of area. The problem with developing states are that there's not enough schools in like developing areas. For example, the suburban areas, there is like they actually have like a lot of different children who are not actually able to access this sort of like level of education because they do not have the chance to even go to school, for example. Or even if they have like the chance to go to school, the school in and of itself is really unstandardized, right? The quality of education in their side of the house is going to be not that great, because like at the end of the day, when you don't really have this kind of like fund allocated towards like educational development, most people would not truly like focus themselves on like actually advocating for like good education in and of itself, because they don't really see the importance of it. Which is why we really should prioritize the educational development to give chance to these children who are also part of our state, to give chance to these people who are actually like less privileged. For example, like they're not able to live in a certain background, right? Because it is very much because your like degree of education is currently really much dependent on your current birth lottery, whether or not you were lucky enough to be born with someone with privilege, that you are able to access this kind of like good education, right? When at the end of the day, education should not be about privilege, it should be about rights. It should be accessible for each and every one of these children, of these young adults, for example, right? They should not think of like having higher education as a burden. They should not think of you going to university is a burden towards your parents. No, you going to university is something that your state should be giving you the right towards, because it is your right as a part of the country. What about the comparative then? The comparative on our side of the house is that we are able to cater to much more people, because we're not only talking about children in this status quo, right? We're also talking about those young adults. We're also talking about the adults that are actually currently now able to do this kind of, to actually get inside this kind of like university, for example, right? Because there's now much more spaces in the university in and of itself, that they are able to cater to much more people, for example. This also looks like there's going to be a lot of like tuition fee or like tuition grant, for example, right, towards like people who are from underprivileged backgrounds, so that they're able to actually do this kind of like higher level of education. A few points of preemptives then on how economic growth. What side opposition might tell you that focusing on economic growth is going to create new work field, but we try to tell you that first, there's no dire need of work field, because at the end of the day, when you're in the like developing states, this kind of like work field there's already a lot of new work field like popping out right and left. That means that there's not going to be like a really dire need of work field, especially when this kind of like work field that just second, then this kind of like work field that they're going to create is going to be more beneficial towards like these people from upper class, like, because they're not able to cater to underprivileged people. Why? Because this kind of like new work field that they're going to make, when you actually like focuses more on economic growth, are two things, right? First, that need a degree. First, the one that needs a degree of education, and second, those that didn't. And those that don't need the degree of education are just what this kind of like underprivileged people are going to be able to actually join inside, because there's going to be barrier on entry level in the created work field. Proud.